We have Paul Hart on hand again from Texas State University. And what he's going to do is he's going to speak for about 35 to 40 minutes on his book. This book here, Emiliano Zapata, Mexico's Social Revolutionary, a book that my colleague Juan Galvan has said is a paradigm shifting book. And I'm sure we'll get to that both in the talk and in the Q&A. And as he talks today, think about these ideas, these questions. What historical conditions allowed Zapata and his followers to launch a revolution in Mexico, excuse me. Okay. What was his vision? What was his vision about the rights of peasants? What was his vision about women and about industrial workers? And then how did the memory and myth of Emiliano Zapata manifest themselves in the 21st century? If you have any questions at all during the talk, just type them into the chat box and I will be following those, and then I will ask those of Paul after he is finished. And after the talk is over, we'll have a Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes. So we should be wrapped up by about 1 o'clock. So this is, here you see the flyer that we have for this event, and Paul Hart received his BA from the University of Texas of Austin and the PhD from the University of California in San Diego. And this publication on Zapata is the one that he'll be discussing today, but he's also published on the revolution more broadly in the decades of the 19th and early 20th century. Many awards and accomplishments that you can see here: the Harvey Johnson Book Award from the Southwest Council of Latin American Studies, teaching awards, excellence in mentoring, just a really excellence in service awards as well. So we're very pleased to have him on campus today. Well, virtually, that is. I do want to read you one, before we turn it over to Paul, I want to read you one passage in the book that struck me in particular. And this took place in Istanbul, Turkey in 2012. And I'm going to read this passage. A middle-aged Mexican diplomat gets into a waiting taxi at the airport. Speaking in English, he provides the driver the name and address of his hotel. The driver, noting an accent, looks at him in the rearview mirror and says, "You look Turkish. Where are you from?" The diplomat responds, "I am from Mexico." The driver says, "Ah, Mexico, land of Zapata." End quote. What a great quote. And Paul, welcome. And I'm going to turn this over to you as we learn about why that driver would respond in such fashion.
First, I'd like to say thank you very much to Lone Star College, to John Barr, who's also a really kind, patient person I discovered in an earlier technological fiasco I had when I was supposed to present. And also I'd like to say a shout out to my colleague Juan Galvan, PhD from the University of Houston and specialist on modern Mexico and the Mexican Revolution. So this talk derives from the book that was just shown a few moments ago. And I got this photograph. This is a picture I took with like a disposable camera of a mural on the wall outside of Zapata's old house in the town of Aneniquilco, Morelos, in south central Mexico, about 60 miles from Mexico City, but over a pine forest. You climb about 7,000 feet and 20 miles and then drop down into this warm, verdant valley, which is humid, watered by streams from snowmelt on mountains above, and became the center of Mexico's sugar production. And Zapata was born and raised right in the middle of the most explosive agricultural transformation into a sugar producing region in Mexico. Okay, so without any further ado, part of what I'm going to do is read, and then I'll speak extemporaneously also. So to begin, Emiliano Zapata burst onto the world stage in 1911 when he joined the challenge to overthrow the dictator Porfirio Diaz. Let's see. There's Porfirio Diaz, who had ruled Mexico almost continuously for more than 3 decades. From a modest background, orphaned at 16, dead at 39, Zapata surely never expected his initial act of rebellion to lead him into a decade of revolution, make him an international figure, and have him known as widely in death as he was in life, as we noticed with the anecdote about the Turkish cab driver. And, I'm quite sure that Emiliano Zapata never thought that his initial act of rebellion would make him the source of afternoon discussions in American universities 100 years later. So this section I call Zapata's Ghost, and it's on memory and meaning and how those are cultivated and manipulated, used, employed. So the Mexican government on April 10th, 1979, which was 60 years after the death, on the same day as the death of Emiliano Zapata, planned to move his remains from where they lay in the city of Cuautla, in his home state of Morelos, and entomb them in the Monument to the Revolution in Mexico City. So here is the place where he was buried. He was assassinated in southern Morelos. He was brought to Cuautla. His body was displayed in public as a warning to other rebels. And then he was buried here. And then years later, they erected this monument to him. And the government wanted to move him and put him in this building, which is in the center of Mexico City. It was under construction when the revolution broke out, was never completed, and they turned it into a museum. And as you can see, the hole in the center, it's an underground museum, and in the bottom of those pillars are big glass windows that you can look through into the coffins and images of the revolutionary leaders. So that giant dome structure holds in its 4 great pillars the remains of the major figures of the Mexican Revolution. The monument captures symbolically what the ruling party, the PRI, claimed to provide nationally: the unity of all Mexicans in one revolutionary family, represented by one revolutionary party. The government wanted to put Zapata there too, but not everyone has been willing to let him be used for official purposes. This effort to move Zapata was an effort at co-optation by the Mexican government in 1979, after it had stopped delivering on promises to the rural poor, and Mexico had gone through this intense urbanization and had cities ringed with slums. And so this was a symbolic effort to try and tell working people that they, were still on their side. Aware of the government's intentions, Zapatista veterans of the revolution, old men with weathered faces clutching ancient rifles carried decades past, stood by Zapata's grave day and night, defying anyone to come and try and take the dead man away. And so they ringed this plaza with, revolutionary veterans, many in their 80s, who stayed there for about 17 days, 24 hours a day, until the government gave up. Surprised by their resolve, the government decided to let Zapata rest in peace. But why would the government wish to dig up Zapata, 60 years in the grave, and place him in the Monument to the Revolution? And why would those old men, so many years after the fight, refuse to let it be done? The answer speaks to what was won in the revolution, what wasn't, and how symbol, myth, and memory inform the present. A colleague of mine right now, as I talk, is giving a talk about Confederate monuments. So when you think about symbols, Zapata's a symbol. There's a myth and a legend around him that different forces have tried to use for different ideological and political reasons. So similar to Confederate monuments, for example, Zapata is carries symbolic power. The main argument I'm going to make today is that official history has made a caricature out of Emiliano Zapata, packaging him as a purely agrarian leader and limiting him to his earliest ideas as expressed in the Plan de Ayala, which is a famous document written in 1911. It's actually buried underneath the archive in Mexico City in a vault in a tomb that's like 190 feet below the surface in case there's ever any war or catastrophe. It and about 10 other documents will be preserved of Mexican history. Mexico was predominantly rural when Zapata was alive. Today, it is one of the most urban countries in the world, and its great capital of almost 20 million people is one of the largest cities on earth. By focusing almost exclusively on agrarian reform, official history suggests that Zapata fought for an honorable cause, but ultimately he represented the past. The challenges of the modern industrializing and urbanizing world, so the story goes, were best met by the victorious constitutionalists, whose ideas are embodied in the Constitution of 1917, which still governs Mexico. That narrative paints Zapata as heroic, but anachronistic, belonging to the past, pushed aside by the forces of progress. Having marginalized his meaning and turned him into a relic, Mexico's state-building elites gave Zapata a symbolic role to play in helping them consolidate rule. Less than a decade after his death, Mexican officialdom began naming schools, streets, factories, neighborhoods, ejidos, which are communal farms, and towns after Zapata. The government honored and referenced him for decades to help it gain legitimacy with the rural population. Attempting to bury his remains in the Monument to the Revolution alongside Francisco Madero, who Zapata rebelled against, and Venustiano Carranza, who ordered Zapata assassinated, was just one of many symbolic efforts to create national unity and demonstrate that Zapata and the rural population he represented were a pillar of modern Mexico. Okay, so I'm going to provide some context really quick. What caused the revolution in Morelos? The seeds of the revolution in Morelos, the state from which Zapata is from, were sown when the region underwent an intense economic transformation that turned it into the center of Mexico's sugar industry and made the tiny state the third leading sugar producer in the world. Morelos is like, I don't know, maybe a little bit bigger than Delaware. And so it was Hawaii, Cuba, and Morelos. The process transformed the rural economy into a landscape dominated by sugar plantations and ruled by a landed oligarchy who controlled the land, the jobs, the police, the courts, and it was part of a larger pattern in Mexico that saw community-held land, so that held by villages and worked in common and shared in a manner that had been done for hundreds of years, go from 25% of the surface of the country to only 2% by 1910. Backed by the Diaz dictatorship, the haciendas, and let's go back to a image of Zapata for fun. The haciendas, which are large, agricultural estates, think corporate agriculture, grew. Village communities and small farmers lost their land, and previously proud and independent villagers were driven onto plantations as dependent workers in hacienda fields and factories. So the sugar industry is different because there are these big factories right there alongside the fields. So it's part agricultural work, part industrial work. Once on the estates, workers lived in miserable dirt-floored shacks, worked from sunup to sundown 6 days a week to enrich the large landowners, but had no hope of social mobility for themselves or their children. So the situation that prevailed was one of extreme inequality. Corporal punishment was common, men on horseback with whips. Child labor was pervasive. There was lack of opportunity. Education stopped around third grade, and it was an exploitative and racialized labor system, the sugar industry taking root and being employing in the fields indigenous people, then African slaves, then every mixture of Spaniard, Mestizo, Indian, and African as time went on. And the owners and managers were almost always of European descent. They were almost always Spanish. Okay, so it's important to note that Zapata just didn't jump into the revolution. He tried to change the situation in Morelos. He was elected the head of his village council to defend their lands against the haciendas. He joined many court cases trying to protect the community's property, and they met constant defeat. They, paid money, hired lawyers, did research, and always lost the court cases. And so the system sanctioned the stealing of their land. So he became increasingly frustrated. He participated in an election where he campaigned extensively for one candidate, who was by far the most popular candidate and would have won the election, but it was a dictatorship in Mexico, and the dictator was for the other candidate. And so they lost the election. And so now Zapata has tried to work within the system, legally, politically, and been stymied. And so he finally takes up arms and just reclaims the land with like 100 fellow villagers. So it's a small local incident to begin. Now, I don't have time to tell the whole history of the Mexican Revolution. Like, I teach a class on the Mexican Revolution, takes a whole semester. There are books. Some books are 2 volumes long, and each volume's like, that big, like 3 inches tall. So this is a little bit of a, hopefully it wasn't a big mistake. I'm going to try and do this in like 90 seconds. So here's my history of the revolution in 2 minutes or less. So, because you have to understand it to understand Zapata. Francisco Madero was from one of the richest families in Mexico, in the northern state of Coahuila, and he grew tired of the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz because people like Madero were not consulted enough, didn't wield enough political power, even though they were allowed to get rich. And he began to call for democracy. And when he ran for president, and it looked like he might have a chance, Diaz had him thrown in jail. And when he got out, Madero called for a revolution to end the dictatorship and instill democratic governance. Zapata joined Madero, and Diaz was defeated. Madero was elected president, but then once he was elected president, he failed to live up to his promises, like redistributing the land. And so Zapata rebelled against Madero as well. In the meantime, this guy, Victoriano Huerta, was an old general under Diaz. And because Zapata rebelled and there was unrest in other parts of the country and Madero was unable to control it, Huerta staged a coup d'etat to overthrow Madero and turn things back to dictatorship under a military strongman, in this case himself, and he was going to be the new Diaz. The U.S. ambassador to Mexico approved of the plan because U.S. corporations had huge financial interests in Mexico, just briefly in mining and forestry and cattle raising, in oil, and owned like 27% of the surface of the country. I'll go into more detail on that later. So Huerta rebels, Madero's overthrown and assassinated, and at that point, Mexico explodes in revolution against Huerta. Zapata rebels against Huerta. Francisco Pancho Villa in the north rebels against Huerta. He was a friend of Madero's or a confidant. Venustiano Carranza, the governor of Coahuila, rebels against Huerta. And Alvaro Obregón, who was from Sonora and Carranza's main general, also rebels against Huerta. All right, so now we have the main characters of the Mexican Revolution. And these guys, Obregón and Carranza, more or less represent, the upper middle class. Madero had represented political democracy in the upper class, and Zapata and Villa represent working class aspirations, both rural and urban. The pivotal event in the revolution was the U.S. occupation of Veracruz in 1914, because these two sides, these groups weren't able to fight it out, right? Once they overthrew Huerta, there was a split, and the revolutionaries couldn't decide what the revolution's ultimate goals were and what their vision for Mexico was going to be like, right? And so Zapata and Villa, pictured here, joined sides after this famous convention at Aguascalientes in 1914. And Obregón and Carranza joined sides. So it's these two against these two. Problem is, the United States steps in and helps this side, Carranza and Obregón. They cut off weapons to Villa and Zapata and supply Carranza and Obregón. And then those guys also get training. World War I's just broken out. So they get training in trench warfare, completely change the tactics, destroy Villa's cavalry, and then Zapata's left on his own. Zapata's situation was so desperate that to get a gun, frequently, if you were a Zapatista, you had to kill an enemy in combat and take his weapon. And they did this by jumping out of trees, stringing up wires and tripping horses, carrying out sabotage and ambush. Really, he had no chance. So the fact that Zapata was totally outgunned, outnumbered, but never gave up, and was fighting for the weakest, poorest people in society and trying to bring them a redistribution of wealth and more opportunity, made him a popular hero. The fact that he defied invasions, armies, assassination orders for over 9 years made him a legend. But his image has been manipulated. Remember that Mexico was about 80% rural in Zapata's day and is 80% urban today, which means that tying Zapata to land reform oversimplifies the meaning of his movement, but more importantly, it marginalizes him as unmodern and therefore with little to offer the present or the future. So they painted him into this corner by saying he only cared about the land. And then in an urban industrial society, that's really not an issue. Therefore, the guy's an interesting historical figure, but has nothing to say to the present. On the contrary, what I argue in my book, and what I'm going to continue to say today, is that Zapata was involved in the universal debates regarding economic development, national sovereignty, economic inequality, and greater political representation that are central to all developing nations, including Mexico, from his day to the present. And now I'm just going to break it down into some quick examples. The first one, because this is where he started, is land. So I'm going to share his ideas because I've met Mexican consuls, Mexican business people, Mexican judges, actually judge on the Supreme Court. And interestingly, they all think they know something about Zapata, and they all say the same thing, which is the reason he lost was because he had a limited vision that was an agrarian vision, and that he thought Morelos, all of Mexico was like Morelos, and therefore he was parochial and small-minded. And nothing could really be further from the truth, and so that's what I want to try and demonstrate. Zapata grew far more radical as the revolution went on. By 1914, he had issued a, quote, decree of nationalization. And I don't know how much you all know about Latin America, but think about Chile nationalizing the copper, or Guatemala nationalizing United Fruit, or Castro nationalizing all American holdings in Cuba. All that came, after World War II. In 1914, Zapata issues a decree of nationalization to nationalize properties of, quote, enemies of the revolution in their totality and without payment. And after 4 years of civil war, there were plenty of enemies of the revolution, foreign and domestic. The decree also included not just rural property, but urban real estate as well, declaring that funds from the sale of urban properties be used to create, and this is Zapata, quote, banking institutions dedicated to fomenting agriculture with the objective that small farmers are not sacrificed by the bankers and that in this way they are able to prosper at all costs. He also proclaimed that nationalized land, forests, and waters, quote, be distributed in common amongst all the villages that so solicit and divided into private lots among those who so desire, right? So it's not a dogmatic one size fits all. It's based on historical practice and community preference, whether you get your stuff communally or individually. And finally, in order to protect both communal and small individual lands from predators, from loans and not being able to pay your loan and therefore having to lose your land, crop failures, nationalized and distributed lands could not be bought or sold. That's why the ejido laws were the way they were in Mexico for most of the 20th century, and could only be passed on to legitimate heirs. This preserves the land from being purchased by real estate developers or being lost to the banks. Zapata also advocated a national rural credit bank to provide loans, seed, and implements to the communities. He issued an agrarian law in 1915 that nationalized all of Mexico's rivers, lakes, and forests, declaring them, quote, available to all according to the communal system. His law authorized the communities to take the lead, declaring that, quote again, and these are all Zapata quotes, right away and by force of arms, the people should and recover the properties that have been taken from them. Zapata gave the power to the communities to initiate land repossession and divide it either communally or individually, and again quoting him, without it being necessary to wait for the authorities to give them what legitimately belongs to them. So pretty radical revolutionary positions. This next part is called economy. And this is his vision for how Mexico should have developed and pulled itself out of underdevelopment. Zapata attempted to implement a plan for rural industrialization and what would be a partly post-capitalist Morelos. He began national, and so this vision, you might think of Northern Europe or maybe a mixed economy like China's, but it's super radical for, 1915. He began nationalizing the sugar mills, the most advanced capitalist enterprises in the state. The plan was for, quote, new national factories to eliminate the hacendado capitalists and have the state, in the form of general headquarters, that is his military headquarters, run the haciendas, buy the sugarcane that free villagers raised, and employ former dependent hacienda workers in the mills for an honorable wage. The idea was that the restored ejidos would create a self-sufficient rural populace and that rural factories would provide jobs and salaries and therefore participation in the cash economy. One of Mexico's big problems was it had no internal market because the big landlords didn't pay people more than like 20 cents a day, and they gave them beans and tortillas and provided for them in that sort of minimal way, but didn't give them money to participate in the cash economy, save money, maybe start something of their own, etc. So Zapata was trying to rupture that process. This, he believed, would help stimulate other local and regional industry by creating an internal market. It was going to be a hybrid system that reflected tradition and would use the power of the revolutionary government to break the oligarchy and pursue the wider public interest. Small-scale individual property ownership would continue, and this eclectic economy would have space for private enterprise, state-run industry, and communally based self-sufficiency favored by most of the rural populace. Aware of the shortcomings of minifundia, Zapata advocated for small producers to participate in voluntary cooperatives to achieve economies of scale that would allow them to mass produce and market their products and compete with agribusiness. So, think of NAFTA today and subsidized agriculture and big corporate agriculture and how it's crushed the small Mexican farmer, right? Raising corn or whatever. So Mexico doesn't raise a lot of its own stuff anymore. It imports it, or foreign corporations on huge plots raise it. Okay, this next part is called nationalism. At the time, the idea of national factories was new and visionary, especially in a country where most major industries, including oil, copper, textiles, and banking, were dominated by foreign capital. So foreign capital, primarily the Americans, but a little bit the British, owned all of Mexico's railroads. American corporate interests owned 80% of Mexican copper production. Foreign interests owned 90% of all mining, and that was predominantly American corporations. And American corporate and private interests own 27% of the surface of Mexico, including much of the best timber and ranching land, much of the coasts, and much of the frontier, the northern frontier, as well as 100% of the oil. And Mexico's got, the third or fourth most oil reserves in the world. So Zapata's revolution was, in that context, if you're going to confiscate land and divide it up amongst the poor, also a form of revolutionary nationalism. Explaining his movement in a letter to Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, Zapata complained that the hacendados of Morelos behaved like feudal lords who, quote, as Españoles or hijos de Españoles, so Spaniards or the sons of Spaniards, consider themselves to have the right to act as they did in the days of Hernan Cortez, and they see their workers as nothing but slaves, subject to the brutal laws of the conquest. So claiming the sugar factories for the people and the nation was a radical step, far ahead of its time in Mexico and across all of Latin America. This next section is Zapatista education, and this is pretty brief. As he began implementing the revolution in Morelos, Zapata promoted primary education. He only got like a third grade education, but he had friends who taught him, how to read more and different stuff, including international newspapers, Proudhon, and other European thinkers. When some pueblos were slow to open their schools during the revolution, Zapata sent out a circular saying, quote, one of the ideals for which we are fighting is that of fomenting public education. And if, under the pretext that the times through which we are passing are abnormal, we were to neglect such an important branch, we would contravene our own ideals, which shall not happen for any reason. Then in 1917, he directed all municipal presidents, because some communities didn't want to open the schools because they were expensive to run, to open their schools, saying, quote, in light of the improving economic situation and the approach of the harvest, the pueblos are now in the position to support the teachers in the schools. And he created a ministry of public education, right? So he's not just a rebel on a horse in the woods, right? Created the Ministry of Justice and Public Instruction, which provided schools with a formal and uniform curriculum that included books to be used and prescribed break periods for the children to exercise and sing. The ministry mandated an attendance policy for both boys and girls, and so he extended public education for girls, which had not been the case in Mexico, and it had to go through 6th grade, which also had not been the case. Anyway, so kids were supposed to go to school for half a day as a realistic goal for children of campesinos whose parents needed them to work in the fields and do household chores. This next section is called Wider Consciousness, and I thought about this. Excuse me for 1 second. Because of those conversations with these prominent people in different fields, professional lives in Mexico, who had this view of Zapata as just so parochial and limited. And so here's my rebuttal. Meanwhile, Zapata's representatives, he sent representatives to the United States and to Cuba and to other Latin American, and to Spain and other Latin American countries. Zapata's representatives in the United States and Cuba were charged with making the true sentiments of the Southern Revolution known abroad. Far from simply localist or myopic, or even just nationalist, Zapata wrote General Genardo Amascua, who was representing him in Havana, and directed him to relate the cause of the Zapatista revolution to the labor confederations of Europe and of America, saying, quote, the proletariat of the world applauds and admires the Russian Revolution, and it will feel the same sympathy and support for the Mexican Revolution once it fully comprehends its objectives. So this is an incredible moment in world history, the Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, World War I, all happening simultaneously. And he's, aware and involved in a global way. The international propaganda effort failed, but not because Zapata was a provincial who did not recognize its importance, but rather because he had no important connections to the halls of the US Congress, in the White House, or among the American financial community. Just as importantly, Zapata controlled no area with oil concessions, rich mineral deposits, port cities, coastlines, or large American-owned properties. As a result, unable to either threaten or protect important American investments, Zapata had no leverage and was stuck on the outside looking in. And the last part is a view for one revolutionary party. Through copious correspondence with revolutionaries across the country, Zapata said, quote, "We should form one great revolutionary party, inspired by a common program of reforms and capable of giving the country a government founded in the agreement of all the leaders, not in the caprice of a despot." And he was referring to Carranza as the despot. Zapata's call for one great revolutionary party to represent the various elements making up the revolution anticipated Mexico's one-party state under the PRI. Ironically, that organism turned out quite the opposite from what Zapata had advocated, co-opting and controlling the peasant and working coalitions rather than empowering them from the bottom up. Okay, I think I'll move along a little more quickly here to make sure I don't run over time. In 1918, when militarily he was looking beat and he was reaching out, trying to get broader support, he said, "We don't intend the absurdity of imposing a fixed universal standard of land reform across the country. Rather, we hope to improve the conditions for the Indians and the proletariat." He acknowledged that each region and social class had its own special concerns, and then he offered what he thought were the defining issues for, quote, national reconstruction. And they included agrarian reform, attention to worker grievances, transparency and purification of the justice system, the guarantee of municipal liberties, the implementation of parliamentarianism, democracy, and the abolition of personalist leadership, or caudillo. And with the history of Mexican presidentialism and the power of the Mexican executive and the history of dictatorship, you can see why that was important to him. Okay, now I'm going to move towards the conclusion. Never able to triumph militarily, and militarily the weakest faction of the Mexican Revolution, Zapatismo still managed to push the nation beyond the limited political reforms envisioned first by Madero, then Carranza and Obregón, and the other victors of the revolution. By the time of his death, Zapatismo embodied a plan for the revolutionary transformation of Mexican society, and I hope I've made that clear. Many of Zapata's ideas on land reform, nationalized factories, and a revolutionary party became part of the Mexican political landscape, though not in the way the martyred revolutionary had imagined. Winners write history, and they attribute enlightened advancement to themselves, and they offer caricatures of those who lost. Zapata lost. The caricature of him is that he was a noble and determined agrarian. That's him in Villa, fighting for the return of the land and trying to preserve a peasant past, not push society forward, and that he had only limited success because he had only limited vision and appeal. He remains an important member of the revolutionary pantheon that's buried in that monument because he stood up for the downtrodden. Ultimately, however, official history suggests Zapata was destined to lose because time moves forward, and the side that won the revolution and laid the basis for modern Mexico were those with a modern vision for the future. I argue that narrative is not only inaccurate and self-serving, but obliterates from common knowledge the more equal society that Zapata imagined, fought, and died for. But like the old man defending his grave, not everyone has let the official image prevail. The most obvious example was the surprise. Well, there's Zapata after being murdered. They displayed his body in the public square for like 48 hours and made people file by to look at it to prove that he was dead. This is some Subcomandante Marcos, the initial leader of the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the EZLN, which emerged in 1994. The most obvious example was the surprise emergence of Mayan Indian rebels in the impoverished, heavily indigenous southern state of Chiapas, Mexico, who, calling themselves the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, launched a rebellion on January 1st, 1994, the day the North American Free Trade Agreement took effect. The armed phase of the rebellion was brief, but the new Zapatistas identified their struggle as a continuation of Zapata's. They objected to the end of land reform and argued that NAFTA would disadvantage Mexico's indigenous communities and small farmers by exposing them to competition from U.S. corporate agriculture subsidized by the U.S. government. And I would say recent history has proven the EZLN assessment correct. Okay, so towards the conclusion, John Barr read the excerpt from, this is how the book ends. A friend of mine was in Istanbul for a conference on Turkey joining the EU, I believe, and he's a Mexican diplomat. And he's the one that had that experience, and he told me, and so then I put it in the book. So you look Turkish, where are you from? The diplomat responds, I'm from Mexico. The Turkish driver says, Mexico, land of Zapata. Assassinated in 1919, Emiliano Zapata still lives in the popular imagination and in places he never saw. He has made his way out of Mexico, though. His image appears on murals in U.S. cities. Zapata vive, la lucha sigue. So Zapata lives, the fight goes on, or the struggle continues. A world where many worlds fit. And you see Zapata and then the late 20th, early 21st century rebels there. And I really like this girl's shirt. I don't know if you can see it or not, but you look at it, I think it was during Prop 187 or something, because her shirt says legalize LA. Zapata's image appears on murals in U.S. cities, including Chicano Park, which is this image right here, in San Diego, California, graffiti in Chicago, and barrio walls in Los Angeles and Fresno. His name is invoked by civil rights, immigrants' rights, and farm workers' rights groups in the United States. In Mexico, workers challenging the country's neoliberal economic model, citizens protesting voter fraud, and indigenous rights advocates in rural communities resisting environmental degradation caused by foreign mining companies all reference him in their struggles. So that's Chicano Park, San Diego. This is LA. And the thing I really love about this picture is not only did they paint a mural, but they went out of their way to add this whole thing on top to accommodate his sombrero. Here's another mural in California, and it's got a pantheon of civil rights heroes. If you go from the left where it says Si se puede, you've got Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, RFK, Bobby Kennedy, Nelson Mandela. At the top, the woman in Indian dress is Rigoberta Menchú of Guatemala, Nobel Prize winner. Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, and front and center Zapata. Here's the border wall. Zapata has been adopted by rebels without a cause. His image and quotes, such as I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees, emblazoned on t-shirts, tattooed on arms and chests, and his memory is referenced by alternative musical groups. There's Zapata and Che blended together, which I thought was interesting. There's Zapata and the leader of the Palestine independence movement. Anyway, his image tattooed on arms and chest, his memory referenced by alternative musical groups, and his name known to many around the world, including cab drivers in Turkey. So in conclusion, officially portrayed as heroic but antiquated, Emiliano Zapata was actually quite forward-thinking. He fought not for a romanticized past, but for a more democratic and egalitarian future. Given Mexico's dreadful economic record over the last 30 years, 50% living in poverty, great wealth, but incredible inequality, the 14th largest economy in the world, but widespread misery, his ideas, far from antiquated, offer alternatives to consider. Emiliano Zapata continues to live in the popular imagination because the injustices he fought against persist, and because his symbol and image continue to inspire many. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We've got quite a few questions. That's a great talk.
Thanks.
If you could stop sharing your screen, and that way I will ask the questions for you. And so the first question is from Jimmy. And the question is, what was Zapata's relationship with indigenous communities and socio-political practices, particularly given how the EZLN evokes his memory?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Zapata was from that part of Morelos that I described that had a African, indigenous, Spanish past, and over centuries through a blending of mestizaje, you had a mestizo culture. But in the lowlands where the sugar grew, where it was hot, was predominantly mestizo. In the highlands where sugar didn't grow and people were, carrying on practices from time immemorial and living in communal lifestyles, it was predominantly indigenous. And most people still spoke Nahuatl, and most people still didn't interact too much with sort of like European Mexican society. And Zapata was, one of the first things he did when he rebelled was first go through the haciendas and try and get as many workers to join him as possible. And then he went up into the mountains where he gave speeches in Nahuatl. He knew the indigenous language, and he was part African descent, part Indian, indigenous Mexican, and a little bit of Spanish, but bilingual. And so he found a fair amount of support amongst the indigenous, who he referred to as Indians. And he frequently would challenge other armies to stop ransacking and killing innocent Indians up in the mountains and come down and fight.
Okay, the next question is, how did American corporations gain so much influence in Mexico?
Yeah, so back in the 1870s, there was a president of Mexico whose last name was Lerdo de Tejada, and he was a Mexican nationalist, an economic nationalist, and was trying to develop Mexico, internally. And after the Civil War in the United States, there was a lot of capital and westward expansion, and American corporate interests wanted to penetrate Mexico. Lerdo de Tejada didn't let that happen. Porfirio Diaz promised he would. And so various American entities, private, bankers and landowners, supported Diaz. He overthrew Lerdo, became dictator for 35 years, and opened Mexico up to U.S. foreign investment. So it's not the U.S. government. It's, the railroad industry, the mining industry, especially copper, the cattle industry, textile industry, and then eventually the oil industry, right? And then European interests were controlled the banking. And that was all because of the sort of neoliberal, only at the time it was classic liberal, policies of Porfirio Diaz. So he opened up Mexico thinking that that would be the fastest way to develop the country. But instead, it became sort of economically colonized by powerful outside interests.
Okay, the next question is from David, and he asks, could you elaborate a little more on how political and philosophical thinkers of the time influenced Zapata?
Oh man, that's a great question, and I wish I could answer it better. And I looked around for that sort of stuff, right? Because here's the other thing: a lot of those prominent Mexicans that I've met over the years, some would even say, and I guess this is what they're taught, that Zapata was illiterate. And I'd be like, no, he wasn't illiterate. I've read tons of letters that I can recognize his handwriting. So he reads and writes, obviously. And he spent a fair amount of time in this one store with a friend of his and the local school teacher, and they used to read radical literature, drink beer, and talk politics. The only thing I know for sure that he read was Proudhon, because there's an argument that he has with a pretty prominent Mexican intellectual named Antonio Diaz Soto y Gama, who wrote a book about Zapatismo later and was a major politician for 20 years after the revolution. Anyway, and he relates some of the conversations around whether property is theft and stuff like that. So that's all I know. I wish I could answer more. That would be great because I suspect there is more to it. But that was the only tidbit I could find, and it came in like a offhanded comment.
Okay, here's the next question. What was Zapata's stance towards the Catholic Church?
Great question. So when he rebelled, all right, well, before he rebelled, he when he was elected the head of the village defense committee to protect their lands against the expanding haciendas, he was given this huge bundle of documents by the village elders, and he took them, and along with his cousin, they went to the church, and they went up into the choir loft, and they stayed there for like 3 days reading the history of their village, right? So the first place he goes, the safest place in town, is the church, and the place where people will respect what you're doing, right? And so Catholicism, the church, the symbol of the church is super important because not just for religion and faith and belief, but to have communal property, the rights to an ejido and something called the fundo legal. So to have the rights to be a communal village, you had to have a church and you had to give residency to a priest. And so the church in rural Mexico is hugely important, both spiritually and materially. That being said, Zapata wasn't particularly religious. Of course, he believed in saints. Zapatistas carried the Virgin of Guadalupe, images of her in their sombreros and in their vest pockets, in their pants, to protect them in battle. And when the Carrancistas desecrated the churches of Cuernavaca, Zapata was furious, and because it wasn't just a desecration of the churches and the religion, but also the people that would worship there. And he accused the Carrancistas of being so anti-church because they didn't have a real social program of their own, and so they would just go after some obvious target instead of developing their own vision.
Okay, here's the next question from Steve. Do Mexican communists traditionally view Zapata as a backward-looking figure, or do they claim him as a revolutionary inspiration?
Yeah, that's a good question. So everyone that was opposed to the inequality, injustice in Mexico, so communists, anarchists, just opponents of the PRI and whatnot, looked to Zapata, and because his ideology is it's no ism. It's not communism or anarchism or liberalism. It's this polyglot of stuff based on experience and tradition. So they all try and sort of manipulate him onto their side, right? And they'll find things that he said that resonate with what they think. So I think they all think he's a little bit backwards. But that's because everyone does, because all that you ever get taught is the Plan de Ayala and his more moderate stuff. No one ever looks at the platform over like 7 or 8 years. And at first I had no idea why, but now I know why. It's, intentional. So he does look backward, right? So, I mean, communists have an ambivalence, right? They want to love Zapata, but, he's kind of hard to bring in.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can you talk, did he play, it's been a long time since I read this book, but Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, was Zapata, did he play was there a character in that book, in that novel that, it's been a long time for me, Paul.
Same here. It's hilarious you mentioned that. This friend of mine who's a journalist for the Huffington Post, like 3 weeks ago, said, "Hey, you ever read The Power and the Glory?" And I'm like, "Oh gosh, yeah, like, when I was 24."
Right.
And he was like, "Oh man, you got to read it again." So I don't remember.
Yeah, I would recommend to everybody that if you have not read Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, that's well worth doing. Okay, the next question is from Cassie Rincones, and she asks, "What is your next project, Paul?"
Oh, wow. Dang. You sound like the chair of my department. So my next project is, I love Mexico, right? And I love studying Mexico. And I've got 2 Mexican projects, but they're not for books. So one of them is comparing Meiji Japan. So Japan in the middle of the 19th century.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Where it went from agricultural, underdeveloped, occupied by the United States, right? Commodore Perry and all that, and being forced to join the international world. But it ended up being super successful in having the Japanese Empire, right? And it did it in a certain way. And then Mexico, around the same time, had the policies of Porfirio Diaz, and which didn't work out nearly as well as what the Japanese did. So I was going to write an article comparing Meiji Japan and Porfirian Mexico and explaining that as the background to the different trajectories the 2 countries have taken. So that's one project. And the other one is, and I don't want to talk about, the United States too much or domestic politics, but let's see how to phrase this. Over the last several years, things began to catch my attention. And so I'm going to write a book that is about the background and situation in the United States around a few key things: race, inequality, foreign affairs, healthcare. Yeah. So it's going to be kind of because I'm the director of the Center for International Studies here at Texas State. So this is going to be a U.S. in the world. That's my next book project.
Okay, thank you. Well, Paul, this has been a very interesting hour, and we're so pleased that we were able to finally do this. Some great questions from the audience, and I want to remind everyone again, the book is Emiliano Zapata, Mexico's Social Revolutionary, in Oxford University Press's The World in a Life series. And there it is. And Paul, I can tell you a couple of audience members told me they ordered the book while you were speaking. So
hey, awesome. That's great.
It is.
Well, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for the invitation. And, if I ever have anything new or interesting to say, I hope I get to share it with y'all.
Yeah, please do. So thank you all. Several people were saying, tell your dad hello.
Okay, awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me, y'all.
Yeah, great talk.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.